Hi, I'm CJ, and this is Music Monday. So, today we're going to be talking about keys and chords. And then a little bit later, we're going to be talking about some opera music, which is super exciting. Um, so, keys and chords. What are keys? I'm sure most of you, if you've been around music at all, you have a vague idea of what a chord is. We use it in our idioms. It struck a chord with me, or it struck a chord in my heart. So we understand that there's this thing called a chord. Um, we understand when we listen to music that there are chords involved. Today we're going to be talking about them in more depth. The word key. Oh, well, obviously, most of you are going to know the word key because we use the word key for lots of other things, like the key you open your house with, or the key you open your car with, or the keys on your keyboard, on your laptop or your computer, the keys on the piano. You know that there are keys everywhere. So we use the word key for a lot of different things. In music, it is specifically used in Western music, especially as a structure for ordering music, for ordering notes into groups. Um, so today we're going to be talking, I've got some visual aids here, I've got some other cool things, and I'm going to attempt to explain to you what keys are and how we use the chords that come out of those keys. Exciting? I think so. So let's start with the circle of fifths. So the circle of fifths is a tool that I have used, I know a lot of other people have used, to help us learn the keys, the major keys in the Western music structure. Before we go into the circle of fifths, there are three signs or three symbols that I want to point out to you so that as I talk about this a little, as I get into this and I talk about it, you have some reference point here. So the first one I want to talk about is this symbol right here, and this is a sharp symbol. This symbol has actually been used for telephones, and I know it's now frequently used as a hashtag. You'll notice actually that sharps can actually be written two different ways. They can be written like this, that looks more like a hashtag than a sharp sign, but most often they are written in an angle. It's a very, very stylized hashtag. But a sharp is essentially a marker that tells, or a symbol that tells you that the note it's next to has to actually be played up by half a step. And we'll talk in a little bit what that means. By contrast, this particular symbol, which looks like a really messed up lowercase b, is called a flat. And a flat is basically the opposite of a sharp. Instead of going up by half a step, you're going to go down by half a step from whatever note it's next to. I also included this one because it's like the red-headed stepchild, or the third, child. Everybody forgets about this sign when we talk about flats and sharps. But this is a neutral or a natural sign. And basically what it does is it cancels out the other two. So if you see this next to a note in music, and then you see that same note you see that same note written again, and you see this next to it, that means that that note is no longer sharped. So those three symbols are really, they kind of come as a set. So even though we're not really going to be talking so much about the neutral, I wanted to include that in there. The circle of fifths is basically 12 groups of notes that are lumped together based on how many sharps or flats they have in them. And the circle of fifths is a way of arranging those so that they're easier to remember. It's a memory device. And what happens is between each of these tones, there is what's called a perfect fifth, which is a kind of interval. An interval is the space between two notes. And in this case, it's a perfect fifth. And a perfect fifth is actually not 5 whole steps. It's actually 4 whole steps and a half step. So starting at the top, we have the key of C. And the reason that we start at the key of C is because the key of C has no flats and no sharps. It's all neutral or all natural. When we look at the circle of fifths, we actually go clockwise around it. So if you imagine it's a big clock, but if you can imagine a giant clock with a perfect fifth in between each section. Now, why is this important? Why does it matter? Well, I'm so glad you asked. Like I said, this is a memory device for figuring out how many sharps or flats are in each key. And I actually I put these on opposite sides as a thing so that you would be able to associate. So the keys on this side of the circle, on the first half of the circle, these are all sharp keys, with the exception of C. Obviously, C is the neutral key, but all of these have sharps in them. They're written as sharps. So when we look at these 12 keys, one of the easiest ways to figure out either what key it is or how many flats or sharps are in that key, you can come at it from either way. You can come at it from, I know this is the key of G, how many flats or sharps are in the key of G? Or you can come at it from the perspective of, I have one sharp. What key is that? The answer to that is it's the key of G. And the answer to the first question is G has one sharp. Which leads us to the cool thing about this, the way this is laid out. There is one sharp in the key of G. There are 2 sharps in the key of D. There are 3 sharps in the key of A. There are 4 sharps in the key of E. There are 5 sharps in the key of B. That's a lot of sharps. And there are 6 sharps in the key of F sharp. Now that takes care of the sharps. From G down to F sharp, those are all sharp keys. Like I said before, C is actually a neutral. It has no flats, no sharps. So when we move to the flats, we're not actually going to continue this way, going clockwise. We actually go back to C, and at least I do. I go back to C and I go to the left when I'm looking at the number of sharps. When we're going to the left, we have F, which has 1 flat, B flat, which has 2 flats, E flat, which has 3 flats, A flat, which has 4 flats, and D flat, which has 5 flats. Now, a little caveat, there are 2 additional keys that aren't really listed here because they're either or keys. And they're either or of D flat and F sharp. D flat is also known as C sharp, and F sharp is also known as G flat. And so you can actually take the sharps all the way out to 7 sharps and the flats all the way up to 6 flats. So this is the circle of fifths. It's a very easy memory device to help you learn the keys and how many flats or sharps they have in it. And it helps you learn key signatures. So you say, all right, so I know how many sharps are in the key of D flat or D sharp. Why does that make a difference? And what sharps are they? I'm so glad you asked. So here we're going to talk on the keyboard rather than the piano, and the reason being is that the camera can get this a little bit better angle. Okay, so on a keyboard, there are two different kinds of keys. You have black keys, which are these up here, and then you have white keys, which are down here. You will use both kinds of keys when you're playing. Now we've been talking about half steps and whole steps, so I want to just demonstrate a little bit about what that looks like on a keyboard. So the keyboard is actually made up of half steps and whole steps. And half steps are what we call chromatics, or they walk up the keyboard and you would basically hit every key in your path. So if we start on middle C, and remember we found middle C by finding the set of 2 black notes as opposed to a set of 3 black notes. We found 2 black notes, and it's the first white key to the left of the black notes. So we start on C, and we go up to the next C, and we hit every key between those 2 keys. We have gone from C to C exclusively in half steps. So from here to here is a half step, from here to here, from here to here, 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 here to here. And what that looks like in regular motion is, isn't that exciting? So those are half steps, and they're determined by the playing the note that's next. Obviously, if you have 2 half steps, the distance between this note and this note becomes a whole step. So 2 halves make a whole, just like in notes. 2 half notes make 1 whole note. 2 half steps make 1 whole step. When we're talking about keys, and in particular the next level down of keys, which is the scale. So if you imagine that keys are the overarching structure, scales are the next piece of the structure down. Scales offer us a way to play those categorized notes. So I'm going to demonstrate scales with 2 different types, or 2 different scales in 2 different keys. So 2 scales, 2 different keys, so that you can see a little bit of the difference. So the first key we're going to start with is the key of C. The key of C has no sharps and no flats. It is played entirely on white keys on the piano. And this is what the C scale looks like. That is 1 octave of the C scale. We use the word octave, oct meaning 8. And there are 8 keys involved. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So there are 8 tones between this C and this C, which is how we get that word octave. Now, it's very interesting that all major scales are made up of what are called Tetra chords, which means they're made up of 2 sets of 4. You have those 4 and those 4, and they really they copy each other from here to here, 1 step, a second full step, and then a half step. So 1 full step, 2 full steps, and a half step. 1, 2, and a half. The second Tetra chord does the same thing. 1 whole step, 2 whole steps, and a half step. And they are divided in the middle. They're connected by a whole step. So when you play a C scale, you are playing 2 Tetra chords. Tetra meaning 4, and chord being a group of notes together. There's a Tetra chord. That's a Tetra chord. These are technically called broken Tetra chords because you're not playing them all at the same time. You're playing them broken. So those are the Tetra chords. That's how scales are put together. And this works for every scale, every major scale. So now we're going to jump to the key of G, which has one sharp, which is F sharp. And the way you figure that out is you look at your Tetra chord. You say, okay, starting on the key, on the G note, you count one whole step, second whole step, one half step. Then you jump a whole step, because that's the connector, and you're going to go one whole step. Now, you have to go a whole step so you can have a whole step, half step pattern. So you cannot go to F natural. You can't go to the F. You have to go to the F sharp so that it's a whole step, and then from F sharp to G is a half step, which is how you get. And that's how you know which sharps or flats may be in a scale. Now that we've talked about this, I want to talk a little bit about how this gets down into chords, because chords are the next step down. So we've got the keys, which are the overarching framework. Then we have scales, and next we have chords. And chords are a way of organizing the scale notes in ways that give us different sounds. There are different ways of labeling chords. Some of them, sometimes they are called by the Roman numeral names. So in the key of G, you have the I chord, you have the 4 chord or the IV chord, you have the 5 chord, which is, or the V chord, and then you have what's called the V7, which is like this. There are other ways to describe chords, but we're going to talk about them primarily as Roman numerals. I personally find that the easiest way to identify them, and this is why. When you're looking at a scale, you can easily number each tone in the scale 1 through 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And based on those numbers, you can find the chords easiest. So the I chord, I is the Roman numeral for 1, actually starts with the bottom note or the root of that chord being that first tone. And the I chord is made up of the first, the third, and the fifth tones of the scale. The 4 chord or the IV chord, you would go up to the 4th tone of the scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, and you would play on, that's the key of C, and you would play the 1st, 3rd, and 5th tones of the C scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 3, 5. And there is, in the key of G, that's called the IV chord or the 4 chord. Now we want to talk about the V chord or the 5 chord, and we're going to go back to our G, and we're going to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we're going to do the same thing we did with the 4. We're going to come up here to the key of D. We're going to figure out what the scale is. In this case, a whole step, and a half step, a whole step to jump over, and then a whole step, and a half step. So here is the key of the scale of D major. So we look at the 1st, the 3rd, and the 5th of D major, and that, because it starts on the 5th note of the G scale, that is the 5 chord or the V chord of the key of G. So we have the I chord or the 1 chord. We have the 4 chord. We have the 5 chord. And then we have what's called the V7 or the 5/7, or sometimes it's just called the dominant seventh chord. Basically what it does is it takes your first, third, fifth, and it adds the seventh tone. Now, often what happens when you play a seventh is instead of playing it like this with 4 chords, which is technically, this would be a tetra chord, instead of playing with 4 notes, you would take this seventh and you'd move it down an octave, down here, and you would drop the third. So you would play your seventh with your 7th tone dropped an octave, your 1st tone, and your 5th tone. And there's the 7th. So now we have the I chord or the 1, the 4 chord or the IV, the 5 chord or the V, and the V7 or this dominant 7th chord. Why do these matter? Well, the reason they matter is because this is how we write songs. Think about how this sounds. Now, I threw the 7th chord in there at the end just so you could get a chance to hear all 4 of those major chord progressions, or of those major chords in the G, in the key of G. But you get the idea. By mixing and matching those chords together, I just created a song off the top of my head by moving back and forth between different chords. When you put chords together in a series, they're called a chord progression. In this case, most often we use the 1 and either the 4 or the 1 and the 5. And you can go back and forth between those 3 chords without really doing a whole lot else. So that gives you an idea of what you can do with chords. So I used G chords or the key of G there. And you'll notice, I'm sure, that as I was moving between chords, I would occasionally play individual notes. This is part of improvisation, part of songwriting. And I've been doing it a long time, so it becomes natural to me, but you can do this too. And basically all you do is when you learn a key, when you learn the key signature, as you're playing the chords, you can play individual notes as long as they're within that key. And I would recommend playing notes that match what is in the chord you're playing. So if you're playing a G chord, which is the I chord in the key of G, I would stick to playing those 8 notes. You can play any of them and in any order until you find what you like. And it's all about putting these chords, an I chord, a 4 chord, a 5 chord, and a V7 chord, however you play it, in the order that you want them to go. You'll notice that I added little notes in between. You can always add notes in between chords to create more variety instead of just play this. You'll also notice that I broke chords up and I played You can do that to create different sounds. The chords are just the building blocks. So feel free to experiment as you're playing different chords. So the piece of music we're going to talk about today is from the Bizet opera Carmen. Bizet is the composer, and Carmen is the title character. She's a gypsy, and she is the main love interest of the main character, whose name is Don Jose. And Don Jose falls in love with Carmen, and then she leaves him for a matador. And then he comes back and kills her in a rage. So, you know, it's a happy, cheerful story. But Carmen's introduction actually starts with this song, which is often referred to as the Habanera. It's actually called L'amour est un oiseau rebelle. So, which means in French, it's love is a rebellious bird. And you probably recognize, like the In the Hall of the Mountain King that we talked about last week and the Moonlight Sonata the week before, you probably recognize this song. The melody line goes like this. So I'm sure as soon as I started playing that, you recognized it. This is the Habanera. It's incredibly famous and it's beautiful. I particularly like it because Carmen is sung by a mezzo-soprano, which is what I am. I'm a mezzo-soprano, which means that I can actually sing this song, which is really fun. I have this song as a thematic arrangement for piano. I don't have the full score. But being a pianist, and because this is played mostly by an orchestra and sung by a vocalist, having just the thematic adaptation is fine. The other cool thing about this piece, and I'm sure a lot of you know that, and one of the things I really like about it is that it's done in a tango style. And the left hand plays more or less the same thing throughout. The notes change a little bit depending on what's going on the right hand, but the rhythm is the same. It's this. Typical tango tempo. Typical tango tempo. And those notes change as you go along, but the rhythm stays the same. And so it really drives, the left hand really drives the piece. That bass line really drives the piece. The way this is played in this particular arrangement is that it starts off relatively soft with the bass line. So after about a measure, the right hand comes in and it plays the melody line. And so on. And it moves along. When you get into that, it plays through that a couple of times. And then it actually changes key. So this actually starts in the key of F, which, as we know from our lovely circle of fifths, the key of F has one flat. And then after that plays through that melody a couple of times, it changes to the key of D, which has two sharps. So as you're playing, you do have to adjust from one key to the next. And this is something that does happen within music, the changing of keys. I actually have a piece that I really enjoy playing. It changes keys, I think, 12 times within like a 4-page song. It's very challenging and it's a lot of fun. So in this case, it only changes once. It's about halfway through the first page. It's a 2-page song. So it just adds a little bit of spice to an already pretty spicy song, being, you know. So we're going to talk, starting next week, we're going to have 4 weeks talking about music history. And I've divided all of music history into 4 categories, or four sections. And so next week we're going to talk about prehistorical music, ancient music, and medieval music. The week after that, we are going to talk about Renaissance music and classical music, what we often think of as classical music. The week after that, we're going to talk about music in the 20th century. And the week after that, we're going to talk about the future of music and what the possibilities are. So I look forward to hearing from you. Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please like it. If you'd like to see more of my videos and be notified, please subscribe down below. I hope you had a great week. I will see you next Monday. Bye.